Good morning if you are in the west coast of the United States, and good afternoon if you are in the east coast of the US, or good evening if you are joining from the Balkans, or like Evgenia and I am right now here in Istanbul. I hope everybody is doing well. I'm going to share with you just a very short um, presentation to introduce the panel and what is coming up next month also. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Yes, you are here to attend the panel entitled The Economic Activities and the Political Ambitions of Bankers and Merchants in Greece and the Ottoman Empire during the crisis of the 1870s. And the chair of the panel is Christine Philliou, whom I'm going to introduce in a second, and she'll introduce our featured speaker and discussant to you. Next month, and actually this is not very far from today, only about 9 days from now, not this Friday, but next Friday, July 8th, we will have Jeremy Walton with participants from the dossier he edited for OTSA's 8-1, volume 8, issue 1, summer 2021 issue. That was Istanbul through the looking glass of the local. Several chapters include several articles, and most of the article authors will be contributing to this panel, so we'll be going over that. Today, the panel is chaired by my colleague Christine Philliou, whom all of you know. She's a professor of history at the University of California in Berkeley. And you have seen her earlier in more than one, I think, WhatsApp as in some capacity as a presenter, as a chair. Earlier, actually, last year when we had the winner of the Vangelis Kechriotis Memorial Travel Grant, again, she very kindly was with us because she is also one of the people who really launched the fundraising campaign that created this award back 6 or 7 years ago. And the award has been given since. We actually we have enough funds to continue giving it for quite a few more years, but we took the occasion as a small replenishing moment. So we have a little fundraising going on, and I can share the link for that in chat in a little bit with you. If you are so inclined, please consider it. Any amount counts. The point is to, have a good safety net for the continuation of the award. And Christine Philliou is, of course, the author of 2 books, Governing Ottomans in an Age of Revolution, that, again, many of you will know. And her more recent book, you should also have heard, but in case you haven't, is A Pass Against History, Turkey. A Pass Against History will be probably featured at a WhatsApp event at some point in the coming year, I would hope. We couldn't quite fit it somewhere yet. Yes, now, Christine, I'm going to stop my project sharing here. You take it away.
Thank you so much. I want to thank first Julia Phillips-Cohen for being the other person that made a lot of effort to get this fund started and create this hopefully institutionalized way to remember Vangelis. And I want to thank Baki for taking up the baton and really supporting this idea and organizing these events and doing this next push for further fundraising, which is really important to the continuity of the project. Vangelis, I guess I will just say that it is, I'm very glad that we're doing this, and yet I almost feel like his memory is alive no matter what we do, because it's quite mind-blowing to me how often his name comes up and his work comes up with a very wide range of people, even just in the last year since the last event. So his memory is certainly alive, and his work and his personality and his energy has left an indelible mark on all of us. And I think this is a special this Dimitri's paper, and Dimitri is a special case that is sort of a turning point in that he was not an actual student of Vangelis, right? So the first 2 years of the scholarship we happened to give just to people who had actually studied with Vangelis, which was wonderful that we could support that research. But now, how many years have passed? 7 years have passed since his passing. And, you know, we're getting to the point now where it's people who didn't study with him, and yet Dimitri's work is actually perfectly suited to honor Vangelis and his interest in his work, as we'll see today. And it's really, as I was reading the summary and his some information about his dissertation, I was just thinking that Vangelis would have loved to be here and talk about this. It's like perfectly the issues that he loved to talk about Greeks that were between the Greek state and the Ottoman state, and just all of the fascinating issues that come up. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I know he would be too. Now, just to introduce our speakers, first I'll begin with our discussant, Evguenia Davidova. I hope I pronounced that right. She's professor in the Department of International and Global Studies at Portland State University, and her research interests focus on the late Ottoman and post-Ottoman Balkans, including trade, travel, nationalism, gender, and public health. She has published recently, in fact, the forthcoming issue, I guess, right? July 2022, in Comparative Studies in Society and History. Congratulations. European History Quarterly, Clio, Femme, Genre, Histoire, Turkica, Aspasia, Journal of European Economic History, and others. She's the author of Balkan Transitions to Modernity and Nation States Through the Eyes of Three Generations of Merchants, 1780s to 1890s. From 2012, and the editor of Wealth in the Ottoman and Post-Ottoman Balkans, A Socioeconomic History, 2016. Her new project, with the provisional title Dutiful Nurses, War, Public Health, and Gender in Southeast Europe, 1878 to 1939, focuses on the intertwining processes of state and nation building wherein public health played a key role. And she will be discussing the paper of Dimitrios Stergiopoulos, who was born and raised in Athens and has quite an illustrious pedigree already. He studied with Efi Kanar in Athens for his BA, and studied Kemalism as the foundational ideology of the Turkish Republic and something more than the anti-monarchical Turkish nationalism. And then he did his MA at Leiden under the supervision of Eric Zurcher, where he explored whether liberalism can be considered as a source of inspiration for an anti-liberal ideology, such as Muslim nationalism of the late Ottoman Empire and its consequent incarnation as Kemalism. Since 2016, he's been pursuing his PhD in the history department at UC San Diego under the supervision of Tom Gallant. And he has been employed for the past 2 years under COVID circumstances, I guess, at the Institute of Mediterranean Studies in Rethymno, Greece, in the research program of value chain analysis of tobacco in Greece, funded by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation. We will see today that his interests are centered on the transformation of Southeastern Europe and the Middle East from the 18th to the 20th centuries, focusing on the incorporation of the region into the capitalist world economy. And in his PhD more broadly, he's focused on the economic and political role of the bankers and merchants in Athens and Istanbul from the end of the Crimean War until the War of 1897 between Greece and the Ottoman Empire. And he's looking at how these strata navigated the turbulent conjuncture of the 1870s and how they were able to consolidate their position as social and economic elites. He uses primary sources from non-state historical actors, such as newspapers, pamphlets, ego documents, biographies, memoirs, and private correspondence in Greek, Ottoman, Turkish, English, and French. And with that, I will hand it over to Dimitri. Welcome.
Okay, please. Great.
And congratulations on getting the scholarship.
Thanks so much. Thanks. In order to give this speech, one of the things I mentioned to him and this is really the truth, is that for me, the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association intellectual communities, one of the main communities of people that I like to interact with. I like to hear about the research. I like to listen their opinions. I write first and foremost for this group of people and for people who do history of Greece and of Greece and Turkey. And so, first and foremost, this is a really wonderful experience for me. The second is that when we were speaking about this immediately I thought about Professor. In my talk, I would be asked someone that is really set the foundations for my own research, and Professor Philliou work about the discursive crisis of the Ottoman, one of the ways that the 1870s, and then the work of Professor Davidova about the three generations of merchants in Bulgaria, but also about wealth in the Ottoman Balkans and philanthropy, gave me another way to conceptualize my own research. And it was like, when I first read those books, I thank God so I can use this research to mention about Kechriotis. 10 years ago, in 2012, I went to Boğaziçi University as an Erasmus student, and my professor in Turkish was Ceyda Arslan, Professor Kechriotis' wife. I knew Professor Kechriotis, but I was too shy to send him an email or anything like that, and he didn't offer a class in the fall semester in 2011-12. Instead, I took a class with Meltem Toksos that was a wonderful experience. The first person that introduced me to the book. Once, with some friends, we were in a restaurant very close to Taksim Square, and by luck, we met Professor Arslan and Professor Kechriotis. And there we spoke for 5-10 minutes, and I told him certain things that I like, and he was really interested about my ideas and my research. And I was like, maybe one day we'll be able to work with Professor Kechriotis. So when all of us learned about the disease and his loss, it was like, for me, it was really someone that you were looking forward, as Professor Philliou mentioned, to ask his opinion, to ask what he believes. And in the end of my presentation, I will mention just a tiny bit how and why Professor Kechriotis helped me with my own research, but I don't want to delay anymore. Thanks.
Dimitri, may I ask whether your Wi-Fi connection at home, if where you're staying, does it change from room to room? Sometimes moving in the house myself, we are experiencing a little bit of
my internet is not very good.
Yeah, you're breaking up every once in a while. I wonder, you might consider turning off your video. I'm going to turn off my video too.
Okay, I will try to turn off my video. I hope it works. Yeah. Okay.
Right now I'm hearing you, but every once in a while you go away. And
okay, good. Okay, I will stop my video. I think that will help. Yeah. So, people have already spoke about my research, and I hope I will not have any interruptions. More or less, what I'm studying is about the story of bankers and merchants that were active in Istanbul and Athens after the Crimean War until the War of 1897 between Greece and the Ottoman Empire. Specifically, I was curious to find out how they dealt with a multiple of crises that impacted the whole region in the 1870s. And I think, my main argument is that although the 1870s was a decade with a lot of pain and horrible experience for a lot of people in the region, for these people it was like the high point, the peak of their influence, and their values became very hegemonic in the context of the Ottoman Empire and in the 1870s and 1880s. After 1890s, things kind of changed. And as I mentioned, Professor Kechriotis, among other people, late Professor Kechriotis, among other people, have spoken about it. So, okay. So in my research, the whole plan is this. I'm interested in 4 different things that these bankers and merchants did. The first is how they accumulated their wealth and how they secured that the wealth stayed within their family. So becoming rich is not easy, and the conjuncture in which someone is becoming rich is very important in order to understand the nature of economy and the nature of a society in the Ottoman Empire in Greece in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. The second is the issue of modernizing reforms in Greece and the Ottoman Empire. More or less modernizing reforms, etc. How the question of whether these people would like
Dimitri, are you there? I think you are there, but we are having trouble hearing you at the moment. I am just wondering on the cuff about maybe an alternative way. I think I shared my number. Maybe you could consider calling me on WhatsApp, and then I can share your audio from the phone. Might that be an option, or is there any possibility for you to move in your room or house to a different location closer?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, right now we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, I did change my room. I hope we will be able not to have any problems right now. Sorry about that.
All right. Okay, no problem. All right.
Okay, so the second thing was about, as I mentioned, their stance towards the modernizing reforms in Greece and the Ottoman Empire, and whether all of these people were willing to embrace this revolutionary change that, like politicians like Trikoupis in Greece or Fuat Pasha in the Ottoman Empire were pursuing. The third is about those. Why did they decide to pursue philanthropical activities, and why was it important, and why did they invest such a considerable amount of their fortune and their capital for this? Who were the recipients? In which countries did they do these philanthropical activities? And were they intended to specific communities or the whole society? So would they do, like the charity was only about Christians, were about Muslims as well? All those things were really interesting to me. Fourth, the last thing I'm interested about in my research is about the political aspiration of these people. Some of these bankers decided to run for the parliament, but some of them did not. So for me, it's intriguing why some of them try to translate their economic and social capital into political capital, and some of them decided to stay in the back without any without doing it. Do you see my screen when I share it, or did this stop?
The screen is good. There's nothing good about the screen. We are all good.
Oh, good. So I will, okay. So I move on, and one of the main things that I'm mentioning is that I decided to focus both on Greece and the Ottoman Empire because the activities and the scope of these people were beyond the context of the Ottoman Empire. So if we just try to study, let's say, a banker like Zarifis in the context of the Ottoman Empire, then we miss how he was like also intervening, how he was active in the Ottoman, in Greece or in abroad in England and France. And the same is about bankers like Sigros, who was first a banker in Istanbul and then he moved to Athens. So although I could speak about a lot of countries in my research, I decided to focus on two of them for obvious reasons. I don't have the space, the time, but also I don't know all of these languages. So my research, I use personal and family archives from the 19th century, writings. I also use writings from the people who are not themselves bankers or merchants, but they're like their allies, like politicians, intellectuals, things like that. Because very often the values, the ideas were not expressed by these people, but they were hiring also like they were having other people speaking on their behalf. And very often, so when we hear like intellectuals and to speak about the need of modernizing reforms or opposition to modernizing reforms, we know that sometimes express their opinions of their donors, of their patrons. Also use journals, magazines, and newspapers because this is the time period that the public sphere is blooming. I'm not going to speak a little bit so much about secondary sources. There have been quite a lot of them. However, but one of the two things that are really very important for me from the secondary sources were like the political history of the Ottoman Greek community, where we had Ottomanism and ecumenism versus Greek nationalism, that also late Professor Kechriotis wrote about it. But I think this is something that takes place more later on than in the period, but also works more theoretical, but also about capitalism and world system theory in Eastern Mediterranean. So today, and in the next, I hope, no more than 15 minutes, I will speak about the role of the bankers of Galata and the role they had in monetization and integration of the Ottoman economy to capitalism from Western Europe from the 1840s until the 1880s. I think the role is very, very important. It's something that we don't see in most of the countries in Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East, and the Balkans. So it's something that differentiates what happened in the Ottoman Empire from the rest of the region. So also, these bankers and these merchants were instrumental for the support that the Ottoman reforms, the modernizing reforms, had among the non-Muslims of the Ottoman Empire in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, what some people call Helleno-Ottomanism, but also the same happened in the Armenian community. Lastly, and this is a very interesting case for me, is that some of these bankers, like Andreas Sigros, migrated from Istanbul to Athens in the 1870s, and they were like one among the first people that like undertook significant investments in Greece, but also created the first bubble in the Greek stock market. Became other bankers like Zographos became landowners in Thessaly, but also like Sigros tried to force the Greek government in the 1880s to establish a mechanism that would control the revenues of the Greek state based on the Ottoman public administration. So we see how certain things travel from country to country, and often our historiography doesn't stress those connections. Here we see some of the bankers that were instrumental in this process. Those are some of the most famous ones, but personally, I'm also interested in less famous ones, like, for example, Spouloudis, that he was a partner of Andreas Gross, and he was a politician in Greece. So it's not that I will only write about those three, but those are probably the most famous ones in the second generation of bankers, because in the first generation of bankers in the 1840s, probably the most famous one was Rallis and Baltazis, among the Greek-speaking bankers of Galata. So in the 1840s, we see how Ottoman Greek bankers moved from Phanar and the old city to Galata, and gradually they lose the character of being money lenders and usurpers, and they're becoming bankers. So this is an interesting transition. I think that tells us a lot about how Ottoman economy changed and how we see the emergence of a domestic banking system, and this is a process that I think is kind of unique in the Ottoman Empire. So the main role until 1856 was to offer an alternative to the Sultan in order not to have direct contacts with international capital markets. So the Sultan didn't look that he needed money from the West. He would just borrow money from his subjects, but then his subjects would borrow money from the capital markets of the West and then borrow this money to the Sultan. So this was, for me, and this is the first process we see that how these people accumulated their capital. The second is that we have to understand that like debt and deficits was like the norm in the Ottoman society. It looks like that everybody was in debt and deficits was the way things worked. So these bankers would like finance the deficit of the state budget. And one of the ways they would do that is that the state often would pay his employees and his contractors with orders of payment. That would be like a piece of paper that would say, okay, in 2 years I'm going to pay you back, or you can have access to this revenue whenever we will like receive this money. Because that meant that like those state employees would not have this money for 6 months, 1 year, 1 year and a half. They would sell those orders of payment to the bankers for a reduced price. So these bankers would accumulate those orders of payment and then would like take care in order to cash them. Of course, they offered certain laws with their loans were like had very high interest rates, more than double than the ones that we find in Paris or London. And I don't think that this is an issue of greediness. This is, I think, an issue of how was the structure of capital market in the Ottoman Empire, in general in the European periphery, that there was certain scarcity of capital, and because due to this scarcity, the price in order to buy this capital was more expensive. I think that was the underlying reason for these high interest rates. I don't think that the bankers in London were like less greedy than the ones in Istanbul. That's my point. However, after the Crimean War, in the end of the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire became part of the Concert of Europe officially. It gained access to the capital markets, and then we have a period of like massive borrowing of the high port from the West. And then when we have this in this period, those bankers don't anymore serve as middlemen, but they still finance the short-term needs of the state. So the state, even when it had access to this massive capital in the West, still needed the domestic bankers in order to cover to meet its payments, to pay its employees and stuff. So the second role that these bankers had was like they would like offer loans to the patriarchate in order to cover its own budget deficits, and to the clergymen in order to secure their appointment by bribing the members of the Holy Synod and the High Port. So this is a very important aspect of Ottoman politics. Bribing or giving gifts was an essential part of how you would secure an appointment in the state or in the church. That meant that you need to find significant amounts of money. That created the need for the Ottoman economy to be monetized. And this led to the emergence of this domestic banking scene. So this is like, for me, a very, very interesting thing that, like, I don't know if we have such a strong pressure of monetization in other peripheral economies as it was in the Ottoman Empire. I think, for example, I don't think that in Greece there was such a huge demand for the economy to be monetized. So for these loans, the bankers would use the revenues in Romania as a lien. But after 1859, the Patriarchate had to find another source of income because these monasteries, the revenues were appropriated by the newly unified Romanian state, and this led to tensions between Bulgarian-speaking and Greek-speaking prelates, politicians, and the flock. Other people like Professor Stamatopoulos have written about this, and this really has helped me a lot. So other activities of these bankers, and other people have written about this as well. Tax farming has become a quite rewarding activity for provincial bankers and provincial merchants and officials, but also tax farming and auctions. In order to bid at an auction, you need money. So again, we see this need for monetization, and so we see how the capital did not only stay in Istanbul, but also travel to the provinces in the form of tax fund. Lastly, they bought land from provincial Muslim notables when their estates were not anymore part of the Ottoman Empire. This happened in Thessaly, to a certain extent in Bulgaria, or when these notables could not repay their debts. And this, for some people, this is related to the process of how the ayans are not anymore an important stratum in the mid-late 19th century, because they lose some of their estates and their power to these Christian merchants and bankers. So these bankers were not isolated from Europe. Instead, they would form partnerships and establish European modern banks. The Ottoman Imperial Bank was mostly French and English bankers, but the rest of them would have would be the partnership of an Ottoman banker with someone from Europe. So we see how this domestic banking scene would be closely linked to the Western Europe. In the 1850s and 60s, the next 20 years, as I mentioned, the Ottoman Empire had access to a significant capital, and this led to the financialization of the economy. People write more and more about this, but and this kind of reminds us a little bit our own period. But since the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, we see how trading state bonds, financial products, stock markets, investing your capital, investing your savings, is becoming more and more popular in Europe, but also in the Ottoman Empire and Greece. And I think I argue that these bankers were instrumental in the spread of those activities in Greece and the Ottoman Empire. However, as we know, stock market is a risky business. So after in the 1870s, we start to see bankruptcies, and we start to see a lot of conflict among people who lost their fortune. one of the most famous one is Lavriotica that happened in Greece in the early mid 1870s. I'm not just going to speak a lot about this here, but what we need to know is that a well-known banker from Istanbul, Andreas Gross, decided to come to Greece and there to invest on a mining business in Lavrio. And people thought that this would be one of the safest investments. So we have a bubble. And but then, because people thought that there was gold in this mine and things like that, but then this was not true. So this banker became immensely rich, Andreas Gross, in the 1870s, and it was one of the major political crises that occurred in Greece. And we see a banker as the main responsible for this. What is interesting for me is that we see that there is a willingness of the broader public in Greece, the Ottoman Empire, London, Paris, to invest its money to more risky enterprises and investments. So I think we see here something is changing in the 1860s and 70s, and it's a different conjuncture. So, as I mentioned, the 1870s was a period of conflicts, and we also have a wave of defaults, and this happened with the Ottoman Empire in the 1875, which created a huge uproar among people that owned Ottoman bonds in the West. And a product of this anger is the conflict between Stefanos Xenos and Austin Layard. Stefanos Xenos is not a very famous one. He was a merchant and a financier, a Greek who was living in London. And he was considered, Austin Layard, responsible for the default of the Ottoman. Xenos considered Layard responsible because he persuaded the public in English, the investors in England, in Britain, to invest their money in the Ottoman bonds. Austin Layard was a famous archaeologist. He did a lot of excavations in Mesopotamia. He was also an MMP, Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, where he promoted the Ottoman bonds. He was an ambassador in Madrid and then in Istanbul during the Eastern Crisis. So, and Xenos published a pamphlet that's one of the primary sources I'm using, and where he considers the financialization of the economy as a very problematic process. And he argues that the Ottoman Empire could encourage commerce with Europe by lifting trade barriers, and it used a different class of capitalists to come to her aid and accelerate her progress. So we see that even among these very supporters of economic liberalism, we see conflicts between people that would prefer a more traditional approach towards international trade and others that prefer to trade in bonds and state loans. And Xenos represent the first opinion, Layard the second. People, I guess most of the people here do know about all those historical events. I'm not going to speak about all of them, but what is interesting is that in such a dense historical conjuncture, the bunkers of Galata became crucially important for the Ottoman Empire. And I'm going to speak about this afterwards. But first, as we can see here in those two maps, the Ottoman Empire lost a significant part of their territories from 1875 to 1881. And this also made a significant loss of revenues and income, among other things. So in this very dense historical conjuncture, the bunkers of Galata became even more important than they used to be in the 1850s, before the Crimean War, or during the 1860s and 70s. Here, the bankers continued to give short-term loans to the Ottoman Empire for 6 years, from 1875 until 1881. Also, the Ottoman Empire was able to acquire one more loan in 1877 for its war against Russia, although it had declared default 2 years ago. So that means that technically it did not have access to international capital markets, but it was able to meet its budget deficits. And this is something that I argue differentiates the Ottoman Empire from the other countries in the region. Due to the importance of those bankers in Galata, when the negotiations started between the High Court and the debtors in 1879, the bankers of Galata had a preferential treatment. So they would they would be sure that their loans would be repaid. However, when the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established in 1881, things did change, and the importance of the bankers of Galata was the bankers were not anymore so important. The Public Debt Administration introduced more efficient ways of collecting taxes, but deficits were not as common, and the High Court gained some of its credit worthiness, so it was able to directly borrow money from the West. And so in the 1880s and 1890s, we see gradually this stratum to disappear to a certain extent. If we compare the experience of the Ottoman Empire with the one of Egypt or Greece, we see that in the case of Egypt or Greece, when they declared default, they had immediately to start negotiations with its bondholders. There was not a domestic capital market that could borrow money to the states in order to delay their negotiations. And Greece tried to have something like a domestic banking system. We kind of have one, but it was never large enough to meet the needs of the Greek state, even for some years. So my two last points here is, the first is, while I was doing research while I was looking for articles on those issues, I came across this very interesting article from the Times from 1879, and in the first paragraph on the left side, they call the bankers of Galata as the vampires of Galata. I think this is very interesting because it reveals to us how these bankers had allowed the Ottoman Empire to resist a little bit more, to delay for a little bit more time its negotiations with the bondholders abroad. And we see that there was a first competition between the ones who owned those bonds, and they were living in England and France, and the ones who were owning some of the debt of the Ottoman Empire, and they were living in the Ottoman Empire. So, and the vampires of Galata kind of explains that. But I want to be clear about this, that those people that the bankers of Galata were they would sell their money very, very expensive. So calling them the vampires of Galata is not something beyond imagination. It's kind of plausible, but I do think that to a certain extent, it was mostly those characterizations came from their competitors abroad than from the political institute, the political elites of the Ottoman Empire. This is my feeling, but it's I think interesting to see this competition between the Ottoman banking system and the one abroad. Lastly, because my presentation have been a lot about elites and bankers and merchants, I found this description of what was the actual experience if someone visited the Ottoman Ministry of Finance in the 1880 during the bankruptcy, and we see that the ministry was besieged by people that were asking to be paid. So that means that the default created a huge problem among people that were like state employees and were waiting for their salaries. And actually, as we see, first we have like this crowd of Turkish women that were in the yard and they could not even get into the building. And then we have this old blind man in the threadbare civil uniform, so an old civil official who is like trying also to have access to the offices. If we go to the second floor though, we find a crowd of unfortunate creditors and that were able to reach almost the room where was the minister. And in the room with the minister was a number of individuals in black coats and red faces that were actually having access to him. And they were the ones that could be probably managed to receive some payment for their orders of payment. Lastly, I think this narrative kind of gives us a hierarchy of people that were expecting their money from the Ottoman state, and we see that in the lowest category is this crowd of Turkish women, then is this old blind man, then this is a crowd of unfortunate creditors, and then the individuals of the black coat. So this hierarchy shows that like access to political power was instrumental in order the Ottoman Empire to pay its debt to you. And this, as a conclusion, tells us a lot about how closely linked were those bankers in Galata with the Ottoman political elite, were like their closest associates. And my point is that like we cannot have a complete history of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century without having those people in the center of the narrative, because they were the ones who would like facilitate the transfer of capital from the Western Europe to the Ottoman Empire, but also facilitate how the Ottoman political system was functioning. Without those short-term loans to the state officials, you could not bribe, you could not give gifts, you could not secure employments. And this was how things were happening in the Ottoman Empire. So thanks so much. I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. And now we have Professor Davidova.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
Probably you cannot see me well because I'm in a hotel room trapped. Okay, so I wish first to thank Baki for inviting me to participate in this session, and I also wish to congratulate Dimitris for choosing such a fascinating topic and sharing with us his research. So read my notes. They're not very long, that we have more time for the conversation. So the paper joins a group of scholarship focused on exploring the complex entanglement of economic, social, and political practices of the non-Muslim members of Ottoman elites. 19th century Greek merchants and bankers, many of them linked to the Kechriotis and the neo-Kechriotis, have been studied by scholars. This paper provides fresh interpretations on the Greek-speaking members of the Galata bankers by placing their financial activities within a broader Ottoman, Balkan, European, and transnational framework. Dimitris demonstrates familiarity with both classic and current research. He uses a synthesis of several social theories, including network approach, that combines the views of the adherents of modernization as well as world system theorists. Through this lens, he interprets the fluid mix of economic interests, political loyalties, and social practices. In other words, he is situating the financialization of the Ottoman economy within social and geopolitical relations by contextualizing networks at the intersection of capitalism and modernity. I will highlight two main dimensions that I consider very interesting, and after that I will say a few, I have raised a few questions. First, by drawing on a wide array of players, Dimitrios is looking at processes of negotiation, mediation, political brokerage, and coalition building by a non-homogeneous group in a changing environment. The paper focuses on the shifting role of the non-Muslim economic and social actors in the Ottoman capital. The standard narrative suggests that these elites, who were major financial actors before the Crimean War, saw their influence and relevance as providers of internal borrowing diminished after 1856, when European financial institutions entered directly into the picture. Dimitrios, however, provides a nuanced study of continuity, transformation, and repositioning through the use of various financial instruments and extra economic forces. Second, by extending the analytical scope beyond the bankers' interactions with the Ottoman bureaucracy and the patriarchate, he includes state and non-state institutions that serve the interests of the Greek state and various transnational financial regimes. This seems a fruitful approach to analyze the linked modernity capitalism. The move from commerce to financial investments is not new, though. It fits within the third generation debate, which was initiated in the 1920s by Henri Pirenne. He contended that merchant families survived only for 2 or 3 generations and did not develop dynasties. If they were prosperous, they moved to less risky and more prestigious arenas such as bureaucracy or aristocracy or both. Fernand Braudel transferred the discussion in the broader framework of structural shifts in the capitalist economy. More recently, Martin Daunton has provided similar examples of bankers in the City of London. The Ottoman case thus is part of a broader pattern, but has also its own specificities. So now I've raised three groups of questions. One is around how these networks functioned. And I'm interested in seeing more comments on the versatility of these, quote, portfolio capitalists. And this is a term that is used originally by Sanjay Subrahmanyam and C.A. Bailey. So my question is, was there anything particularly Ottoman in the way these multi-ethnic networks functioned? And what commonalities and differences did they exhibit in both the Ottoman Empire and Greece? So that's the first group of questions, is about the functioning. My second question is about, you touched upon in the end a little bit, but about the social constitution of these groups, and what was the social and ethnic stratification within the group of the bankers. To what extent these elites were porous and open to newcomers, and how did they reproduce themselves? And my last question is, when I was reading your text, I was wondering about the women's role. As Ioana Minoglou has highlighted, women's roles in business were pivotal due to, quote, the predominance of the family in Greek society and business, end quote. So I was wondering how this familiocracy was expressed in the financial world you analyzed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dimitrios, would you like a chance to respond to that before we open the floor?
Yeah, okay, yeah, of course. So very soon, briefly. So the issue of like whether there is something specific in the case, I will start with this question. The issue of if there's something specific in the case of the Ottoman Empire, this is a very tricky question. My tendency as a researcher is to find the commonalities than to find what makes something unique. So I would say no. But then why would we need to study the Ottoman Empire if something is very particular about this? So, but I guess maybe the difference, what makes unique the Ottoman Empire is that like the proximity of the economy of the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe. And like this kind of creates certain events even from the 18th century. So that I do want, so this is in a very early stage of economic modernization in Europe itself. So this might be a differentiating factor, because in Greek historiography, we have like narratives that like the crisis of ship owners in the early 1800s was one of the underlying causes of the revolution of 1821. So I do wonder if like we can find some like instances of modern economic processes in other areas. But portfolio capitalism is actually, I'm participating in a panel in the forthcoming MESA with a bunch of people. They were preparing articles around this issue about portfolio capitalism in the Ottoman Empire and economic history. So I'm really intrigued about this. And for me, as I mentioned in my presentation, the issue of monetization and the relationship with like monetization, investments, and the relation with capitalism, or if it's something that we can find only in modern economic processes, is like intriguing. So portfolio capitalism is one of the main theoretical paradigms, and that I'm looking forward to employ in the future. So similarities and difference between Greece and the Ottoman Empire. I think that more often than we would like to admit, Greek political elites between the two countries were like imitating each other in a lot of different ways. But I think like modernization, economic modernization, and the relationship between economic elites and political elites is very similar. So, and that's why I'm interested about this group of bankers that migrated from Istanbul to Athens in the 1870s, because I would like to see how similar were like their activities and the mentalities in both economic environments. Lastly, about women, it's one of the main problems that we have is that often our sources speak about women, but not so often women speak about those issues. So sometimes I have to try to find, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in family archives and personal archives, is because I would like to identify whether the person whose life was actually taking the decisions, the economic or political decisions, were women, but like due to the framework in which those women were functioning, they could not express this openly. And one of the few exceptions that you, in the edited volume that you mentioned, is like the daughter of Zarifis, that she spoke about. This is one of the few that she's like publicly embracing the role of the philanthropist, but usually it looks like that. I think it's a kind of a performative thing, that like the husband, the man, the brother, the father has to look like the decision maker, but I doubt that this was actually the truth. So, but as far as I can tell is that I'm actively looking for sources that bring into perspective how women influence those decisions. So thanks so much for your nice words, and I'm looking forward to other people's questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And at this point, if anyone has questions, you can either put them in the chat or you can just raise your hand and ask live. Baki, Professor Tezcan.
Hi, Dimitri, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm curious whether you actually had access to their internal documents about interest rates, etc. I just was curious whether they applied in the same year, the same interest rate when they gave loans to the Ottoman state and they gave loans to the Patriarchate. I'm just curious whether they had a preferential treatment to the Patriarchate as Greek Orthodox bankers or not. Can you like see what kind of rates were given to these different consumers of their loans?
Yeah. So my research is about economics, but it's not economic history per se. So it's not how I always do the interest rates. But one of the main problems that we encounter with these people, and other researchers have also mentioned that, is that a lot of their expenses were informal. So if you would bribe the Grand Vizier in order to pay you a part of your previous debt in order then to give a new loan to the state, and I don't know, then make him another favor, like I don't know, by selling his own teeth in Trabzon or something. Those dealings are not translated into, okay, the interest rate is going to be this and that. My feeling, as far as I have searched, is that they had those three types of customers. The first was the Ottoman state. Probably they would give the best interest rate to the Ottoman state because it was their main client. But then high-ranking officials were even better clients. So they would have they would give better loans to the high-ranking officials. And then we have the Patriarchate and the merchants in the provinces. Due to the lesser political importance of the Patriarchate or the merchants, I have a feeling that would get not as good deals as the ones of the Grand Vizier or the Ottoman state. But this is my feeling because I don't have access right now to those archives. I will, if I have, I will let you know for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's a quick question in the chat. How many bankers were there? And then we have a couple hands up for live questions. Do we know?
Tens.
It's like Fenariates, who knows?
Tens, less than 50. The main ones would be less than 50. I don't think there were more than 50, 60 people. The most names you find is 15, 20, 25, and then people die because it's 30, 40 years, things change. But I don't think it's a big group. But
and Armenians similar? Sarafs, or that's different?
I didn't speak about this. I will give 1 minute answer. The Armenians look like they dominated the money lending business from the 1820s until the 1840s due to things that you know better than I haven't. But then when the Ottoman Empire needs to borrow money from the markets in the West, then the Greek bankers and the Jews as well are becoming more and more important. And the Armenians and the Muslims, because we still have Muslims in the provinces, are taking care of the trade with Eurasia, Iran, Central Asia, etc. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, Boriana Antonova Goleva, and then Christian Atanasov.
Hello, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I just want to share another aspect of these bankers, which in support of your presentation, they took active part in railway entrepreneurship in the 50s. I have a lot of references about it. In general, as you may know, in the 50s, the Ottoman Empire started to develop railways, and many entrepreneurs came to the empire in search of new opportunities. So, in fact, all these Ottoman bankers started to take part, to be interested in this type of activities along with the banking entrepreneurship. As you mentioned, Austin Henry Layard, in fact, he is not very known for this project, but he also had a railway project in the Ottoman Empire, the so-called Mecidiye Railway. And he also managed to find some local bankers and merchants who took part in the project, like Pierre J. Hava, also Mihran Bey, but also George Zarifi and certain Bautaji. I'm not sure if this is who is this Bautaji exactly. So one of the main shareholders was George Zarifi, in fact. Finally, the project was failed. But this is also interesting aspect in support of what you said. And another thing is that, in fact, Austin Henry Layard was interested. He had another enterprise in the region, in the Ottoman Empire, both, and in Greece. He had tried to develop a mine for emery stone on Kushadasa and the Naxos Island. So maybe this would be interesting information for your research. I just wanted to share with you. So that is my, thank you very much.
Thank you. And Christian.
Thank you. Thank you that you give me the floor for some comments and questions, but first I should introduce myself. After all, Christian Atanasov, historian and archivist from Sofia, Bulgaria. So once again, thank you for your very interesting talk. I have just one, how to say, brief question. What do you think was their favorite political ideology? You mentioned some kind that they were in some ways supporters to parliamentarism, in some ways supporters to liberalism, in some ways supporters of nationalism. I'm asking you because I know that it's very difficult to mark a group of people with, how to say, one etiquette, but we have a similar studies here in Bulgaria about our traitors, I mean Bulgarian traitors during the 18th and 19th century. So they definitely were, after all, nationalists. So what is your opinion on that issue? And excuse me, but sorry, but sometimes it's very, how to say, loudly around me. So that is my question. And thank you once again for your very, very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Dimitri?
Yeah, so I'm trying to answer this is very interesting because like we have a normative understanding that like liberalism, the main allies of the liberal constitutional politics going to be the bourgeoisie, let's put this way, bankers, merchants, etc., etc. Like this is what we expect to happen. And the weakness of liberalism in Turkey is often related to the lack of Muslim merchants and bankers. This is a very well established ideology. I think that like probably it's most of those bankers were attracted to some of those ideas, to be honest with you. Lately, I'm reading stuff about like the July monarch in France, and like we have a very narrow liberalism, and how bankers were like the backbone of this political regime. So I'm intrigued about how this might be also the case of what we're thinking about Ottomanism and liberalism. But definitely we see people like Zarifis, that he was like a very good ally of Abdul Hamid. He was a very good ally of like he was a huge supporter of ecumenism and more traditional ways of of politics in the Ottoman Greek community. He was never an ally of the liberals in the Ottoman Empire. So there we see some kind of differentiation. But I think, let's put this way, that either you were a supporter of Abdul Hamid, I don't know how can we call that. I cannot find a good name for Hamid's ideology. Conservatism?
Neo,
I don't know.
Neo-absolutism.
Yeah, no matter what, it's a modern ideology. So, Zographos, who's an ally of Murad V, and Zarifus, who is an ally of Abdul Hamid, both were very fully agents of modern politics. This is my belief. So yeah, they might be conservative. They might believe I don't know, some neo Metternichian way of running a modern state, but I don't think it's some kind of an anti-modern political ideology. That's my idea. And sorry, the last thing is that in Greece, we have a similar kind of conflict between modernizers and traditionalists in the 1880s and 1890s. And I think there we see a kind of a similar political conflict to take place. So yeah, that's how I approach this issue. Thank you. Thanks so much for your question.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question from Nurhan Davutian. Oh, you're muted. Oh, we can't hear you. You're on mute. Could you unmute yourself? Uh-oh. You need to unmute yourself because we can't hear you.
Mute. Okay.
Yes, now we can
Okay.
hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry for the confusion. I would like to make a comment about Henry Layard. He was the founder of the first Ottoman Bank in 1856, and afterwards, after they formed a partnership with the British group in 1863. Originally it was an English bank in 1856, and in 1863 they formed a partnership with the French group. And Henry Layard was the chairman of the board of the Unified Ottoman Bank and a major shareholder of the bank till the end. So when he came to the Ottoman Empire as the British ambassador in 1877, he was a major shareholder of the Ottoman Bank. This has to be kept in mind, and there certainly was competition between those Ottoman bankers like Zarifi, etc., and Henry Layard. Okay, he was not only an ambassador; he was a major banker himself.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the pamphlet that this Greek merchant Xenos published, the subtitle is against the stuff that Layard is saying about Turkey's financial condition and the lies of Layard. And this was published in London. So we see the conflict between, and I don't think it's a conflict about nationalism, to be honest. I think it's more a conflict about different ways of where to invest your money. And
exactly. It's a commercial rivalry, capitalist rivalry.
Exactly.
Competition.
Exactly. And for me, it's, I mentioned this in my, thanks so much about in my presentation, whether you should invest your money in industry or in commerce or in mines or in trade or in bonds. I think there's behind those decisions, we see also a normative understanding of what kind of economic growth is the most appropriate or the one that we should pursue in order to maximize economic development. So for me, it's a little bit this issue as well. So, but thanks so much for your comment. Yeah, thank you.
Oh yes, there's another question in the chat. What about the British and French taking hold of the Ottoman Bank? I guess the question would be, how does that affect these bankers?
Yeah, so originally the British and the French and Layard came with the Ottoman Imperial Bank and tried to stop the monopoly of the Galata bankers in the domestic capital scene of the Ottoman Empire. But in the late 1870s, we see the Galata bankers actually to be allies with the Ottoman Imperial Bank against the international bondholders. So the bondholders from London and Paris would like compete with the ones, with the domestic ones, who is going to get the preferential treatment from the Sultan. So we see how those alliances do change, and it's interesting because the language is that like the domestic ones, like the Ottoman Imperial Bank, are described as Levantines, although some of them were stationed in England, like Layard spent most of his life in London, not in Istanbul, but he was still a Levantine banker. Interesting. But others were like international bondholders. So just the way you invest your money change your identity. Yeah, so.
And Baki, is that hand up anew? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I had a basic question. You might not have looked into this because you said you're not like an economic historian, you're looking at other things, but I'm just curious whether your research showed you any ideas about where they found the money from. You told us a lot about whom they lent the loans, the money, but where were they getting their money? Were they getting it from European markets? Were they actually having people deposit? Were they functioning like modern banks once they became Galata bankers? I'm just curious about that side of who was supplying the money that is given as credit.
Great question.
I guess I don't think that a lot of people would deposit their money per se. That's my gut feeling to those banks in the 1840s. That's not my feeling. But I think that like they use their income from international trade, previous loans, controlling finances of like the Ottoman state, or tax farming, making money through those activities, and then investing those monies into borrowing. And also all of those people were players in the stock markets abroad. Like we have this story that like in the 1870s, some bankers, probably Zographos, migrated to Paris. And there are people say, oh, he bought a huge house, one of the best neighborhoods in Paris, and he's making so much money in the Paris stock market. So
yeah,
I think it's so this is thing. But I think that like from the 1820s, we have a period of like increasing economic growth in the Ottoman Empire. That means more wealth, that means more money. Someone is appropriating the money. And I think that a significant part of it, at least in the Ottoman society, ends up being in those merchants and bankers through those mechanisms. That's my understanding. So it's yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And could I close out with one last question about these issues about the patriarchate lending, borrowing money, I guess, from these guys. And you did mention that you didn't have the sources. Are there the sources? Because I mean, I know Dimitrios Stergiopoulos would be the closest person, but I don't know if he gets into the actual quantitative facts of money lending and everything, but are there sources for this open to us? I know they exist, but are they accessible?
I am afraid no. And you know better, like some of us, I will in the future, I will try again and again to have access to those things. But unfortunately, like whoever wants to write anything about the patriarchy, there's a huge gap of like what we can read about. We do have some data about the budget deficits of the patriarchate, and this is like maybe 30%, like the difference between expenses and income. And this is almost the same like the deficit of the Ottoman state. That's very interesting. Like those two mechanisms have more or less the same gap between income and expenses. So It was this characteristic of how Ottoman economy works, 20% down, whatever you do. I don't know, but like that was something like that was concentrated in Stamatopoulos research, where I also draw those examples about the patriarchate and the patterns.
And I guess following on that question in the chat, was the patriarchate as powerful or rich as the Vatican? I will let you answer that question.
The answer is simply no.
No, I'll answer it with you. No.
Not even remotely. Yeah, it's a different. It's a different. It's completely different.
It's apples and oranges.
Exactly.
Say the least.
Yeah. So.
So that is a good question, though. Yeah.
But if anybody knows any comparative research about economics of the Vatican and other churches, please let me know. I haven't come across anything, but there might be things out there. So yeah.
Great. I think that's it. Baki, would you like to say a final conclusion?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Christine, Dimitri, Evgenia. Thank you so much. And to the people who asked questions, thanks so much for being with us. And if you would like to, you can join us again, not this Friday, but the Friday after, with a panel on Istanbul from the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, the last issue. You can prepare yourself by reading the pieces that will be presented, or not, just join. I hope you have a wonderful summer, and then we'll be with you again in August and September with more events coming up that I'll let you know over email. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for making it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Baki. Thank you, Evgenia.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.